Chapter 29. Silas's Search. While Jenna, Uller, Septimus, and Beetle were setting off along the charcoal burner's gully, Silas and Maxie were waking up in a cold, damp teepee in the Wendron Witch's summer circle. Maxie had enjoyed his night in the witch's circle. Silas had not. The teepee had leaked, and the bedding had gotten wet and begun to smell of rancid goat. To make matters worse, Silas had been kept awake by the giggling of a gang of teenage witches, planning a raid on what they called Camp Heap, which was where Sam, Ed, Eric, and Jojo Heap lived. Silas, who had no wish to know what his 4 sons were up to when it came to Wendron witches, had stuffed his ears full of rancid goat wool, big mistake, and tried to get to sleep by counting sheep, even bigger mistake, as the sheep had turned into rancid goats and started chanting. After a while, Silas had realized that the chanting was in fact the witches chanting around the campfire. Exasperated, he had thrown a pile of stinking goat fur over his head to drown out the noise, and had finally fallen asleep. As Silas lay staring blearily at the top of the teepee, a young witch put her head around the door flap and said, "The witch-mother requests that you join her for breakfast." Silas struggled to sit up, and the young witch suppressed a giggle. Silas's straw-colored curly hair looked like a bird's nest, the kind of nest that would belong to a large, untidy bird with a hygiene problem. From the middle of the nest, Silas's green eyes peered out, trying to focus on the young witch. Thank you. Please tell her that I would be delighted." Even though Silas felt as if he had spent the night with a wet goat sitting on his head, he knew that any invitation from the witch-mother must always be treated with reverence and respect. A few minutes later, Silas and Maxie were sitting beside a blazing campfire. A strong smell of damp dog, with subtle notes of none-too-clean wool, filled the air as Silas's ordinary wizard robe steamed in the heat. Behind him, the young witch who had woken him poured out a cup of hot witch's brew, and avoided breathing in too deeply. Sitting opposite Silas was Morwenna, the witch-mother, a large woman with piercingly blue witch's eyes, and long graying hair held back with a green leather headband. Morwenna wore the Wendron witch's summer tunic of green, and as witch-mother she had a broad white sash around her more than ample waist. The young witch passed Silas a steaming cup of witch's brew, and he warily took a sip. It was, as he feared, disgusting, but it was also strangely warming. Morwenna was watching him with a fond smile, so Silas slowly drank a few more mouthfuls. As he did so, he felt the ache in his bones fade, and his spirits begin to drag themselves up from the deep pit where they had spent the night. The young witch passed Silas a wooden bowl containing what looked, at first impression, like cereal with caterpillars. Silas inspected it dubiously, but, telling himself that the flecks of green were most likely some kind of fleshy herb, he took a spoonful. His first impression had been right. They were caterpillars. Silas swallowed with some difficulty, because you never, ever spat out food given to you by a witch. Gloomily, he surveyed the enormous amount of caterpillar cereal that he still had left to eat, and wondered if he could sneak any to Maxie. He decided not to risk it. "I trust it is to your liking?" asked Morwenna, noticing Silas's expression. "Oh, yes, it's very, Silas bit through a particularly large caterpillar with legs. "Crunchy. I am so pleased. They are a late spring delicacy, and give great strength and will clear your head. I thought you looked in need of them." Silas nodded, unable to speak right then due to a mouthful of caterpillars and a sudden inability to swallow. One ghastly gulp later, Silas decided he had to be tough. He would herd all the caterpillars together and get it over with. Gathering his courage, he scooped up and quickly swallowed 2 large spoonfuls of caterpillars. With great relief, he looked at the remains of his cereal, which was now caterpillar-free. But, as Silas was taking a great gulp of the witch's brew to wash down the last resistant caterpillar that had got stuck between a gap in his teeth, the young serving witch stepped forward with a small bowl full of writhing green tubes, and dutifully added 3 more spoonfuls to his porridge. "You seem preoccupied, Silas Heap," said Morwenna. "Ahem," said Silas, overwhelmed by the latest caterpillar incursion. "Thank you, Marissa. You may leave us now," said Morwenna, waving the young witch away. She took Silas's bowl from him with a smile, and gave it to a deeply grateful Maxie. "Too many caterpillars this morning, perhaps?" she said. "But, very remarkable caterpillars. I feel much better, thank you." And it was true. Silas did suddenly feel better. In fact, he felt very good indeed, clear-headed, strong, and ready for the day. Ever since I heard about Nico's disappearance, I have been expecting you, Morwenna said. Silas looked amazed. Oh, Morwenna, I know Nico is in the forest, but I do not know where. And I know that he is not, said Morwenna. Are you sure? Asked Silas, who had great respect for Morwenna's knowledge. Morwenna leaned forward and placed her surprisingly dainty hand on Silas's arm. Very gently, she said, Silas, I must tell you that Nico is not in this world. Silas went pale. The teepees surrounding him began to sway, and he wanted to be sick. You mean he's dead? He said. Hastily, Morwenna said, No, he is no more dead than those who are not yet born are dead. Silas put his head in his hands. He found what Sarah Heap scathingly called witchy talk difficult at the best of times, and now was most definitely not the best of times. He needed to talk to his father. Silas's father had been a practical man, a good, honest shapeshifter wizard, who was now living as a tree somewhere in the forest. He would know what to do. Morwenna, said Silas, there's a tree I need to find. There are many trees in the forest, Morwenna observed. Silas wondered if she was making fun of him, but then she said, And some are more tree than others. Some were born trees, and some became trees. I believe the tree you seek was not a born tree. I am right, Silas Heap? Yes, said Silas. To seek a tree not born of tree is no easy task. They grow in the ancient groves, which are dangerous places. Some are pleased with their choice to be tree, and others weep and wail and wish to be as they once were. These are the ones that prey upon the traveler and lure her to her doom. Who is it you wish to find, Silas Heap? Benjamin Heap, my father. Ah, your shapeshifter father. It is true what they say. Your family runs deep and dark, Silas Heap. Do they? I don't know why. Dad just liked trees, that's all. He was a quiet man, very slow in his ways. I think it probably suits him. But, well, last year the boys, Septimus and Nico, they found him, and I need to see him, Morwenna. He'll know how to find Nico. He must. He must. Morwenna had never seen Silas Heap so desperate. Remembering the time many years ago when Silas had saved her from certain death by the forest wolverines, she made him a generous offer. I will take you to your father, she said. Silas gasped. You know where he is? Of course. I know each tree in the forest. How could I be witch mother and not know this? Silas was speechless. He had spent the last 25 years searching for his father, and Morwenna had known all the time. You are strangely silent, Silas. Perhaps you do not wish to see your father after all. Oh, no, I do. I really do. 5 minutes later, Silas and Maxie were following the witch mother down the spiral path to the forest floor. They took a narrow track that Silas knew would lead them past Camp Heap, where Silas had spent the last few days, until both he and the occupants of the camp had become totally exasperated with one another. Quietly they skirted Camp Heap, which at that time of the morning was still a slumbering circle of what looked like great piles of leaves. These were in fact what the Heap boys called benders, simple shelters made from bent willow branches and leaves. The only sign of occupation was the smoldering of the campfire, which the boys always kept burning, and the sound of snoring drifting out of Sam Heap's bender. Silas felt the urge to go wake them all up and tell them to get up and do something, which was what had led to much of the trouble during his stay, but he resisted. Silas, Maxie, and Morwenna walked deeper into the forest, through dark glades and gullies, and into hidden places where Silas had never been before. They traveled fast, with Morwenna moving swift and agile through the trees. Silas concentrated hard on following the witch's forest green robes, which took on the shadows and shapes of their surroundings, and he knew would quickly disappear if he looked away for one moment. Maxie loped behind, his stiff old joints complaining at the long trek, but not letting Silas out of his sight for 1 second. Suddenly Morwenna dived into a thicket of giant ferns. Silas followed her, but the thick stems would not let him pass. He pushed and shoved. He even insulted them under his breath, but they would not move. He succeeded in nothing more than getting an impressive collection of giant burrs and 2 sticky toads stuck to his cloak. Silas fought the temptation to call out Morwenna's name, for he knew that the sound of a human voice in the forest, even in daytime, can draw the kind of attention a human does not necessarily want, so he waited, hoping that Morwenna would soon notice he was no longer following her. Maxie gratefully lay down and licked his weary paws, but Silas was not so patient. He kicked his heels, he scratched his itchy head, and dislodged 3 tree beetles. He prized the sticky toads from his cloak and stuck them onto a nearby sapling, and then one he picked off 25 giant burrs that had stuck onto his cloak, and threw them into the ferns, but still there was no sign of the witch-mother. Silas decided to risk a whisper. "Morwenna! Morwenna!" A few moments later Morwenna emerged from the ferns. "There you are," she said. "Come on, keep up." She plunged into the ferns once again, but this time Silas followed her so closely that he was very nearly treading upon her heels. The thick stems made way for the witch, but not for Silas. As soon as Morwenna had passed through, the giant ferns began to close ranks again, forcing Silas and Maxie to be quick and slip through the narrowing gap. It was lucky, thought Silas, that Morwenna was so much wider than him. As they moved through the ferns, the light faded to a green dimness. At last they stepped out into a great green cathedral of trees, the tallest trees Silas had ever seen in his life, their branches arching gracefully up into the canopy of the forest hundreds of feet above him. An unexpected feeling of awe came over him. Maxie whimpered. "Your father is here," Morwenna said quietly. "Oh." "I shall leave you now, Silas Heap," Morwenna half whispered. "I have business at our winter quarters. I will return for you on my way back." Silas did not answer. He could not imagine ever leaving such a peaceful place. "Silas," Morwenna prompted. Silas shook himself out of his trance and answered, "Thank you, Morwenna, but I think I want to stay here for a while." Morwenna saw the faraway look in Silas's eyes, and she knew she would get no more sense out of him. "Well, take care," she told him. "Be sure to spend the hours of darkness off the forest floor. The ancient groves are dangerous places at night." Silas nodded. "May the goddess go with you." "Morwenna?" "Yes, Silas Heap?" "Where exactly is my father?" Morwenna pointed to the tangle of gnarly, mossy roots below Silas's boots. "You're standing on his toes," she said with a smile. With that she was gone.